Because I was a monitor, I could go straight in without waiting for the bell. The hall was a new, pin neat, with floorboards waxed slippery. The blackboard, where Miss Spriggs tacked the tonic sulphur, was coated rich black, and tiled walls of the corridors were scrubbed and last year's paintings gone. All that was left was a framed black and white photo of the King. Junior 6th classroom had 3 rows of iron-heeled double desks, newly varnished and sticky to touch. I collected the red-ribboned register from the pile in the hall. First boys' names, then girls in fine copperplate. Betty Hunt, Marlene Senior, Colin Morehouse, the same as always. No one had left and no new names were added. I took the can with a long thin spout and went round filling inkwells, including Frankie's in the desk he leaned on while he taught us. I put the date on the blackboard, September the 8th, 1952, and underlined it with a yard-long blackboard ruler. The keys were on the desk, so I unlocked the main cupboard and took out packs of new exercise books, broad lines for composition, narrow for arithmetic. On the back of every book was a panel of do's and don'ts for road safety. I put a pen in the groove of every desk and sharpened a set of pencils with a sharpener screwed to the table. I could hear the shouts from the yard, voices chanting, "Specky Four Eyes." Smigger, the headmaster, appeared at the door. "We're having a staff meeting. Go and ring the bell. Tell the monitors to see them, and tell them to be quiet, or they'll know what." Everyone was terrified of Smigger except the teachers, who were polite to him but did what they wanted in the classrooms. He was old, was Smigger, with grey hair and starch white collar and a warm blue suit. He wore spats over his shoes and carried a cane, which he waved when he wanted to make a point. He waved it now. "Make sure to tell 'em. Anyone starts being clever, tell 'em to wait outside my room. Double quick." At the end of assembly, he said very severely, "Let that be a lesson to you all. How I start is how I go on." He nodded at Miss Fanstead, who sat bolt upright at the piano, peering through her pince-nez at the hymn sheet. She had a thin, sharp nose, nipped off suddenly, and the dangling cord of her spectacles kept catching her cameo brooch. Her skin was mottled, and her fingers continually twitched the top of her dress, while her watery eyes peered anxiously down her bosom to make sure it was said, that her falsies stayed in the right place. She finally got into her stride with the opening bars of "We plough the fields and scatter." We sang with immense determination to avoid Smigger's attention. He would poke his cane at the shoulder of anyone he felt wasn't giving of their best. He wanted volume, and volume was what he got. Enough to shake the windows, which he went round opening noisily with a long hooked pole, while we said the Our Father. At last it was over, and we filed out and lined up outside Standard 6 classroom with its frosted glass and worn brass knob. "All right, in you go, and no shoving." Frankie Franklin was all right. He had a degree, which was something none of the others had, not even Smigger. He put it after his name on the bottom of reports, F. Franklin, B.A. He knew this put him above everyone, and everyone knew it, even Smigger. It was like army ranks, but somehow there'd been a mix-up. Smigger was a sergeant major and Frankie an officer. You could see that a mile off. Smigger was always extra polite to Frankie, who had a way of looking at people that said, "I've got a degree, so just you watch it." He didn't so much teach as lecture. He was very keen on science, and I was too, and that was why he made me monitor. I had the job of finding items in newspapers about scientific advances, pictures of the moon's surface and such like, cutting them out and tacking them onto the science noteboard. Gradually, he started giving me other jobs, like going to post a letter for him instead of going into assembly. I thought this was Frankie's way of saying he'd do what he wanted. Once, when I was taking a letter to the post box while assembly was going on, I could see Smigger staring out of the window right at me, but somehow not seeing me. Sometimes Frankie sent me with notes for Smigger. I never knew what was in them, but the answer was always the same. "Say to Mr. Franklin that Mr. Smith says thank you, and that were perfectly in order. Frankie was very keen on compositions. He made us do 2 or 3 a week, and he never bothered about the handwriting. It doesn't matter about how good your copperplate is, so long as I can read it. What I want is for you to make it interesting. He'd set subjects like the haunted house, and talk about ghosts and trapdoors and creaking boards, and then he'd tell us we'd 45 minutes and to get cracking. While we were writing, he'd stand and stare out of the window. You could see right over Leeds from our classroom, even tell the time by the town hall clock. Sometimes Frankie sat at his desk on a high stool, and mark a French exercise he'd set his son. He'd give it a mark out of 10, then sign his name with his degree, even there. He was the only teacher who had a car, a brand new Ford Prefect he parked in the yard. We used to stand and stare at it as though it was a spaceship. Frankie lived in West Park, just about the poshest park of Leeds. Detached houses with big gardens and gardeners to look after them. It was good to be in Frankie's class. It made you feel important, because he was so important. Children, parents, other teachers, Smigger, even inspectors from the Ministry of Education with degrees themselves, everybody asked his opinion and listened to what he said. When he felt we'd worked well, he could be very relaxed. He'd open the classroom's other door, that was usually kept locked and led to a black playground that was never used. The hooters from the factories and the sounds of the river traffic would float in on the hot summer air. When he was in a relaxed mood, you could ask him whatever you want. I sat next to Jean Crowell, the girls' monitor, and she once asked him why he wasn't the headmaster. He looked very thoughtful. Jean has an interesting question. Have any of you got an answer? Jack Blakey said he thought it was because he wasn't old enough. And somebody else said he was Jewish, though we weren't really certain what Jewish meant. No, he said, it's not for any of those reasons. It's because I believe that I have a vocation, which means that I believe God has called me to do something, and that something is to come in here and teach you all about the things in the world, good things and bad things, and make you realise you're all special in your own way, and you can do something to make this world a better place. All the great men and women of history, like Louis Pasteur and Florence Nightingale, once sat at desks just like the ones you're sitting at now. They thought that one day they might do something worthwhile with their lives, and because they believed it enough and never stopped working to make their dreams come true, their dreams really did come true. That's what I want you all to do. Think what you can give to the world and try and do something about it. It was the most wonderful speech I'd ever heard. Then I understood why everyone respected Frankie the way they did. When he talked, it was as if he got hold of your soul and shook it till you found out what it was you wanted, more than anything else, and went all out for it. The only lesson we didn't have with Frankie was Spanish. Old Holmes was the school's Spanish teacher. He had been shell-shocked in the war, and his left arm was stiff and continually trembled. He had a limp on the same side, and when he went into one of his tempers, his face contorted and his hair fell over his brow. We were all a bit frightened of old Holmes, but we knew he was some kind of hero. He lived in Spain for years before the war, and there was a rumour that he'd been in a war there too. When we lined up outside his room, he limped out and said, "Atalante." His voice was smooth and brown like his skin, and somehow he'd become more Spanish than English. As well as drilling us in the rudiments of the language, he provided graphic descriptions of life in Spain, of interminable journeys by train across the mountainous terrain, the friendly peasants with their baskets of livestock, and the shimmering landscapes of Andalusia. He told us of the donkeys and their burdens, the heat of the orange groves, and how they danced the flamenco in Seville, great cathedrals with saints and shrines and bullfights, matadors and picadors, and the difference between them, and nights in taverns drinking cheap wine, and learning to pass himself off as a Spaniard. Painting was his other passion. His art classes were famous for his attention to detail. He began with simple exercises in line drawing and worked up to full-scale paintings. He insisted on complete silence and moved from easel to easel, commenting in detail, as though he were Toulouse-Lautrec taking a masterclass. The paintings from his art classes filled the corridors of the whole school, and even spilled over into the infants. Holmes spent his dinner hours mounting and tacking, and the school's best writers, those who won the prize for faultless copperplate, were dragooned into producing neat labels with the titles of the paintings together and the names of the artists. Smigger found the corridor art galleries very useful when visitors came. He was ready for retirement, and you felt he'd been ready for a long time. If there were any changes in education, he really didn't want to know about them. But he did want a smooth passage to his pension, and knew that inspectors had to be soothed. His first tactic was to get Miss Fenwick to provide tea and biscuits in his room, and while this was going on, a monitor went round the teachers telling them to get ready. Once Smigger knew the messenger was back, he'd invite old Holmes to give them a guided tour of the paintings. Holmes' enthusiasm, coupled with his sense of somewhat alarming appearance, and the obvious quality of the work, left the visitors impressed, and old Holmes carefully ended up his guided tour outside Frankie's door. Frankie was ready and waiting, and started lecturing on the importance of scientific education, a subject he never tired of. And by he'd finished and the visit was over, the visitors tottered out to the car, feeling they had been granted privileged insights into the very latest in educational developments. Festival of Britain year, and we were all quivering with excitement. The really big stuff was going on in London, of course, the South Bank Centre and such, but there was a travelling show and Woodhouse Moor, and Frankie had arranged for a special corporation bus to come to school and take us there. He made the boys sit downstairs and then sat at the back to watch what was going on. There was a groan from the boys when he said only the girls could go upstairs. Then he sent me up as well to keep an eye on things. When we got to Woodhouse, we saw a great big tent, like it was Bertram Mills' circus, and caravans parked round with special exhibits. One of them was about radioactivity, and a white-coated scientist passed a Geiger counter over the luminous face of my watch. There was a hum and a blip, but he said it was all right, well below the danger level. In the big tent were all kinds of displays about the progress of science, models of rockets, moon maps and star charts, and grainy photographs of docks and tower blocks. There was a section called Curiosities, with fantastic machines concocted of bicycles with wings and sails from ships, and in charge of these wonders was a great poet called Laurie Lee, who was to be my mentor, and my Margaret was his Rosie all over. Smigger thought our school should do something special to impress the office, and Frankie said we should buy a cine camera and make a film about how the school raised the money and show the school at work, special things like girls learning woodwork and boys learning to cook. There was a great fuss setting it all up, and the worst bit, of course, was finding the money. Smigger said we all had to collect jam jars. If we got 10,000, Morehouse's Jam said they'd buy us the camera. For weeks we went from door to door, asking for jam jars for our mums to wash. All the jars were stored in the inner quadrangle. The number crept up until one morning we had 9,900. Smigger told some of the senior boys to go after to dinner and not to come back until they'd got the last 100, and then they had the rest of the day off. This was the truly wonderful part of my life, my last year at primary school. I don't think I enjoyed the first 2 or 3, but the year with Mr. Franklin was truly and absolutely amazing. He was an inspiration to me, and although when I went to teaching, perhaps some 15 years later, I used very different methods, and my focus was on creativity and music and painting and poetry rather than science, which I rapidly lost interest in. I will never forget Frankie Franklin. I'll never forget that school, long ploughed into the earth, and I'll never most of all forget the Festival of Britain year.